Good morning and welcome to AppCon 2.0 Beyond the Status Quo in Apprenticeship. I'm Juan Gonzalez with net.America, and I'd like to welcome everyone here today to a special Beyond the Status Quo discussion. I'm joined here this morning with Dr. Gore, an activist and an emergency medicine physician in Brooklyn, New York. For close to 20 years, he has been developing programming and solutions focusing on community violence and other disparities affecting urban and global health. Welcome, Dr. Gore. How are you today?
Thanks for having me, Juan.
Absolutely. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. I'm excited to be able to speak and engage with you guys. I love the work that's being done, and anyone who has made it their mission to help improve the quality and well-being of young people as a way to pass the torch on, I will 100% support.
Great. So let's kick this off and start off with a couple of questions we have here today. So I'm going to ask you, tell me a little bit about yourself and what you're currently working on.
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I happen to practice medicine, emergency medicine specifically, across the street from my elementary school. I'm an attending physician and clinical assistant professor at Kings County and SUNY Downstate Medical Center. But I'm also the founder of CAVI, which is the Kings Against Violence Initiative. And CAVI itself is a hospital, school, and community-based violence intervention and prevention program, but really focusing on changing this entire narrative and dynamic about trauma. As an emergency physician, I think about trauma on an ongoing basis, because a bad day at work for me means that somebody may have lost their life or was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And so when we look at trauma itself, we often think about a physical process, but for many of us, we know that trauma is more than just a physical process, but has a major psychosocial impact on the patients, the community, and the family of the person who's been impacted by it the most. And so we wanted to make sure that we cultivated a space, an environment to provide support for people who were considered to be at risk for engaging in interpersonal violence, but also providing support systems for people who have been patients. A lot of, we have there's three different prongs or three different areas of CAVI. One is the hospital intervention program. And so for the hospital intervention, we work with patients who've been injured. So if you're shot, if you're stabbed, if you've been assaulted with a blunt object and present to the emergency department at Kings County and SUNY Downstate, our intervention team winds up seeing the patient or the client to ensure that support is provided. It's terrifying to come into a hospital. It's terrifying to come into the hospital as a patient. It's even more terrifying to go into a hospital as a patient and not really understand the state of your health. We recognize exactly how vulnerable we are when we're in the emergency department. And when people are cared for, when they're supported, not just on a physical level, but on a mental and a psychosocial level, the outcomes tend to be a lot better. And so we have an entire intervention team that sees clients once they're injured. And this is in addition to the regular general medical support team. But they help them navigate their experience in the hospital. They help identify some of the fears and insecurities. And it's almost, I don't want to say it's like a buddy, but it's really just where there is an additional support to the medical team. When we look at trauma, or just taking care of emergencies, there's something that's been referred to as the golden hour of trauma, or just the golden hour. And so the golden hour, this is just any kind of emergency, not just, just even if you took trauma out of the equation, but that golden hour, that the first hour after an immediate event, that's when the patients are most vulnerable. But that's also, if you provide certain interventions, you can completely change the scope on an outcome, and really see how, improve the quality of how that patient does after any sort of emergency. There's another physician named Dr. Parnell Cooper, who I got the chance to meet. He's a trauma surgeon in Maryland, and he describes something known as the second golden hour of trauma, which is, if you provide that additional psychosocial support, we can even further change the scope and that outcome of that patient's experience. When somebody is injured due to violence, there's often a 40 to 50% rate of being re-injured within a 5-year time frame, and the rate of being killed is close to 20%, with each subsequent injury increasing that rate that death rate. And so we're looking at something that can impact people and, in the most vulnerable state possible. But if we can provide support, if we can reach them before some of those critical measures, those critical incidents have taken place, we've helped cultivate and improve the quality of a life of an individual who may not necessarily be here tomorrow. When I'm looking at patients, I don't look at them as being just someone in a completely separate category. I live in central Brooklyn. I live in Bed-Stuy. So the patients that we take care of often come from my neighborhood. The patients that we care for, in some instances, are people that I know or have a specific connection to. We might have grown up together. We may have gone to school together. They may be a neighbor. They may be a friend of a friend. But when you wind up working with people and there's a specific bond because of the proximity of where you live and work and just your respective circles, there is a different kind of energy that's put in to ensure that patient and that community really does well, because we're really talking about community interventions. And so just creating an overall umbrella of support, everything from helping a person get their identification card, helping them process the psychosocial trauma that they've been experiencing, and even just having someone who comes and asks you, are you good? Are you okay? Not just, are you just having pain and stuff like that? Let me give you some pain medication, but really identifying, are you good? Because everybody's good until they're not. And we want to ensure that you feel like someone is going to support you through the entire course of the trauma that you've experienced when you're in the hospital, but most importantly, once you leave the hospital. And these are things that our team and our respective partners, community partners, help provide for the patients. On the other hand, we have both a community program and a school-based program. When CAVI was created, so I've been an emergency physician for, if you include residency and even where I am now, we're talking close to 20 years. It'll be 20 years in May or in May of 2022, which makes me feel really old sometimes when I say that. But this is a long time of really helping try to understand the community. And as an emergency physician, we see a lot of trauma. But we also had this idea and said, what if we work with people before they became patients? Because if they're patients, that means we've missed the boat, and we have to provide an additional costly process or a safety net to ensure their overall well-being. What if you can work with people and meet them where they are before they become injured, before they become patients? Then you have something that's even more transformative and more life-altering. We often respond to people when there's a major tragedy. And we're hoping that our organization, in addition to many of our other partners, and I have to give shouts out to some of the teams that we work with in Central Brooklyn, from the 67th Clergy Council, GMAC, Man Up Incorporated, Neighbors in Action, SOS, East Flatbush Village. I'm having another brain fart of another organization that's based out in East New York. Elite Learners, that's their name. Those are just a few of the organizations that we've been in. Guns Down, Life Up, which is based uptown. Those are just a few of the intervention programs that we're working with around the city to ensure the overall well-being. But if we can meet people before they become patients and provide additional support to ensure that they're well, then we have something. So our school program works at a few school campuses around Brooklyn, and we work with kids who are considered to be at risk. And if you look and identify what's considered to be at risk, that means this is every kid who lives in Central Brooklyn. This is pretty much every kid who lives in New York City, because we have a high concentration of people that are in very close proximity to one another, because there's the televising of trauma, because there's a physical trauma out in the communities, and you factor COVID on top of that, which is just an additional stressor. We have an entire city that's experiencing and trying to process trauma. So if you can create these spaces for people who may be a little bit more at risk for engaging in certain types of activities that may have a negative impact on their overall life and well-being, then we have something to be proud of. And so we have an entire curriculum that we've developed that focuses on mediation and conflict resolution, skill development, idea development, a lot of life skills development, but really kind of coming back to that initial that initial main thing is asking folks and making sure that the people we work with are okay. It's empowering and also creates a different type of vulnerability when you're in a position to ask someone, are you okay? Do you need anything? Not just in a very superficial way, but finding out, are you hungry? Do you have a safe place to stay? Do you feel secure in your neighborhood or in your community? If people don't have food, clothing, shelter, and security, you have an exceptionally vulnerable person. And I guarantee these are people who are going to wind up coming in our hospitals, in our emergency departments, in our trauma departments, ultimately becoming patients, driving up healthcare costs, because that's something we often like to ignore. But it's very costly, but it's a lot cheaper, and it's more rewarding when you can take care of someone and provide support and see that they're well, and not become a patient. And so this is what we do both in schools that we work with as well as communities.
Yeah, that's amazing. That personal touch is something I've never heard before, and I think that's extremely impactful. Very moving for sure. So my next question is, what is the mission of the organization?
The mission of CABI is to help create a safe space and reframe this entire conversation that we're having around trauma and violence through providing support for our community. That's the general overarching mission and goals of the organization. But even that is evolving. At first, when we began working with CABI, well, when CABI was created, and as an emergency physician, I was purely thinking, how do we help change the scope about gun violence and gang violence? This was also before, in a time, in a realm before people had smartphones. This was a time and space before social media existed. The only social media that existed when I first started looking at violence as a public health problem was Black Voices, and that was on America Online. And if you didn't have a dial-up machine or internet, there was no high-speed internet. But if you didn't have dial-up or even understood what AOL was, you had no access to any sort of chat room. And so having social media and have people having this extensive ability to communicate across large distances and articulate their specific emotions, it's a beautiful thing. But we've also seen that it's been able to spark a lot of beef and conflict in places that you might not have traditionally had as much conflict. And so this is, we like to look at the organization as well as our team as being in ever evolving. We talk about live documents when we're speaking about proposals. I feel like the organization itself is a live organization because we have to adapt and understand what the specific needs and the changes within the community and how they're responding to them. We can interpret all we want, but how people are responding to what's going on in the community is a very different thing, and we have to be very attuned to that.
Awesome, awesome. Definitely sounds like evolution in this group is a big thing because, as you said, things have changed from AOL to now Instagram and TikTok and all these different platforms for people to be on. You truly have to find a way to grow with those things. So I can definitely appreciate that. All right. So, what are the barriers you see in educating the youth from these vulnerable populations?
Excellent question. When we think about the term barrier implies that there's some sort of obstructive process. But in actuality, we have to look at this from a very different scope and a very different angle. And because those pathways and those connections to youth and to people who are considered to be vulnerable, they're there already. We just may not see them. And so there are a few things that I think can help bridge the gap that we as educators, that we as concerned citizens, we as mentors, and even apprentice providers need to consider. The first is understanding language. Language it has a beautiful ability to connect populations and cultures around the entire planet. However, if we're not speaking the same language, if we don't understand certain cultural practices of the people that we hope to influence and impact, there becomes a major disconnect. And so that's a barrier in itself. Number two is we also have to think for the person providing the services and the person who's supposed to be experiencing the services. You as a provider, or us as providers, us as healthcare professionals, educators, as job trainers, do we fear the people that we're working with? If there's a fear of the people that we're working with, you're going to have even greater barriers. It's okay to not completely understand, but fear is a very different thing. And for somebody who is vulnerable and they see someone who's engaging with them, who's fearful of them, that's almost a direct implication that that person doesn't want to be around them. And we've all been in situations where we've had teachers or a substitute teacher, or seen somebody on the street, law enforcement, even business owners, who has no interest in the person that is technically the client or the customer. And because of that disconnect, you're treated in a very different way, and you were disregarded, and you looked at as disposable. And as someone who's considered to be vulnerable, we have to ensure that they don't feel like they are disposable. Another thing that's really important to consider is conformist thinking. My mother's a retired teacher. My father's an activist, and he's also a business owner. And so we're always thinking about, who is our client, and are we catering to our client? I don't know how many people have ever had a teacher or instructor or workshop leader say, you know what, I already have all the information that I need. I have my job. I have my degree. This information is for you. When that statement is made, you've already lost the audience. You've already lost that person who's vulnerable, who may be just trying to hold it together. And so if you were going to be providing information, if you were supposed to be articulating concepts that may help improve the overall well-being, or even providing certain skill sets that are going to be essential for survival, you have to think, what makes that student tick? And is our conformist thinking really putting us in a specific box? Because we think that in order to get something done, it has to be done a particular way. I've been fortunate to have had many conversations with engineers and designers, and speaking with them, and artists, and they have a special freedom when they create. They have a special freedom when they convey ideas. So we have to think, am I holding on to what needs to be done in this particular way, or can I really adjust and ensure that how I'm teaching, how I'm providing information is aligned with the overall vision? Like, I don't care how it gets done, as long as people aren't taken advantage of, as long as people aren't hurt or harmed, as long as the vision is the same, as long as that vision is the same, is in line with the vision of the educator as well as the learner, then you have something special that furthers that improves that gap that we often have between people who are coming from vulnerable populations. We also have to identify what are the fears and what are the insecurities of our learners. As an adult who has been learning new skill sets, I think it's made me a much better teacher. I've always done martial arts, from the time I was a kid, but in my mid 30s, and I started studying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and my instructors were a lot younger than I was. They were in their 20s and early 30s, and I felt like a fish out of water. I felt completely uncomfortable, but it also opened up, and I saw how I responded to feedback. I saw how I was responding to criticism. I've been a physician for a long time. I've been in undergrad medical school. Even being a physician, we're talking about 20-something years of dedicating my life to studying medicine and health and science, which is a long time. And so you get to a certain point that you achieve a level of mastery. And doesn't mean that you don't study, but there's a different kind of confidence. And so studying something and learning something as an adult makes us even more vulnerable. And we realize, oh, wow, I didn't realize I was this insecure. And so I think it's made me even better teacher by taking on some additional skill sets as an adult who is completely uncomfortable with something, to ensure that I am being mindful of my criticism and feedback. I'm being mindful of how information is being conveyed to the students that I'm working with. And I teach medical students and resident physicians and nursing students and PA students. And so there are always students around. But there's a different level of intentionality, how I explain things, the repetition I remember I had a mentor in college, and he used to say, repetition breeds familiarity. And sometimes we get to a certain point in our lives, and we like to think one and done. Well, I said what I said, and it's up to you to go figure it out. If you're having somebody who's already vulnerable, they may not have traditionally done well in the academic sense in their school or institution of higher learning. And so you have to identify what some of those barriers that you're really dealing with in order for them to even be in a position to process the information. Trauma-informed care, which is the work that we do with CAVI, is so important because if you don't understand the traumas of the people that you are working with, how do you expect to convey things, particularly when they're vulnerable? If you don't understand their fears, their insecurities, their triggers, how are you going to get them? And if you're talking about very vital information that can help improve job security, that allows them to take care of their families, that allows them to feed themselves, this is information that needs to be conveyed as well as possible. And so it's important that we are exceptionally mindful in how we convey information. How do we limit conformity and just being purists for the sake of purists, but even having a greater level of mindfulness for the language that we're using are key factors in improving or bridging the gap between us and the people who we're working with that are coming from very vulnerable spaces.
Yeah, that is amazing. Communication is so crucial when we talk about trying to understand and learn and really move forward in any type of um, anything we're doing. I mean, if you're not listening with open ears or you're not listening from a blank slate, you're always going to put yourself in those situations. And everybody grew up different, so I can definitely understand how that is a huge barrier. And fear as well. I mean, that was very deep and something that I don't think is spoke enough about. So thank you for that. So this is going to lead to this next question, right? So how do we educate others, or how do we educate others in these type of situations to advance their careers? Like, how do we help? How can others help the youth, to advance their careers?
Others can help youth identify specific things that may help advance their careers. One, by just being present, volunteering time with organizations that are dedicated to providing skill sets that are essential for overall life and well-being are important. In addition to that, making sure that there are support systems to deal with the traumas that people experience. It's not just to convey a specific skill set. When you're in a vulnerable space, I was speaking with a friend of mine earlier today, and we were talking about trauma. She does a lot of work with climate justice, and we were talking about vulnerable populations, and she had brought up um, Kigali. She spoke about the conflict and genocide in Rwanda, and there's a genocide museum in Kigali that all students are required to go see. I think when they're middle school age, and I think it's open to the general public, but specifically students. To help understand the traumas that their country has experienced. A lot of times people don't want to acknowledge the negative elements, negative aspects of their practices. And this may be a business, this may be an organization, this might be an institution of higher learning. And so you have to at least understand where you've been in order to understand where you're going to go. On top of that, because we're dealing with very sensitive information, um, finding out that you've done something wrong or finding out that you've done something that may not have been as effective, it can hit you in a very weird place and make you reject even dealing with the person. You'd be like, I don't want to talk about these issues of what we've done wrong as a company or as an organization because it's too painful for me. But I bring up the situation with that museum is because there's also, at the end of the museum, there's a dark room. There's a place that has social workers and therapists who are there to help people process the trauma that they're experiencing. And so to bring up a lot of things that are uncomfortable is one aspect. To be in a position to process what that upheaval process has brought forth is the next phase. But you also have to just have willing participants. Do you have people who are willing to engage and understand that patients or people coming from vulnerable spaces aren't going to be the most textbook ready students. They may have some fears and insecurities. And if you are willing to, if you are interested in improving well-being and improving that quality of life, then that's 90% of the battle. It's not just as important to say, okay, I want to volunteer and I just want to teach the people what I know. Teaching people what you know is important. Putting them in a position to be receptive to that information is even more golden. And so these are some of the things that are definitely helpful. Um, and you mentioned something a little bit earlier about adaptation. It's so important that we come into these spaces, and this is very engineering driven. A number of years ago, I had a medical student who happened to be an engineer and an inventor before he went to medical school, and I was trying to work on some ideas on how to convey ideas to vulnerable groups in a way that they were receptive. And he said, Dr. Gore, he said, you got to look up this thing. It's called engineering design process. And he said, have you heard of it before? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, it's a cycle. And it's basically how engineers and designers solve problems. And it's done in a cycle because you're always going back to the drawing board and figuring out, how do I do this better, stronger, faster, and more efficient? It starts with, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Then the next course of action is to identify a series of ideas to help further solve that problem. After that, you're supposed to come up and test and create a prototype for something, an actionable item. And then you test that prototype. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're so focused on perfecting processes that the perfection of processes is really an ongoing cycle. In Japanese, there's a term called Kaizen, which is constant, never-ending improvement. And so you have to look at the problems that we're hoping to solve with our respective organizations and our partners who are helping support our mission, is to ensure that there's this cycle, this common motif of constant, never-ending improvement. And then once you've initiated your prototype, you go, what worked? What didn't work? Did we solve that problem? And how do we do it better, stronger, and more efficiently the next time? And so that takes away a lot of the fears and insecurities which come along with getting something wrong. Many of us have a visceral response when somebody corrects us or marks up our paper. And I think about, like, when my mother used to, look at my papers, or teachers would edit stuff, and it looked like they would just bleed all over the paper. And I'd be like, oh, and they'd be like, do it again. And look, people said do it again. It's almost like, oh my gosh, it was a punishment to do something again, as opposed to having someone tell you, and I had some great teachers, and my mother, wasn't dismissive. She said, look, this is just a part of the process. The reason why we have all these different drafts is because you're going to be adding things. You're going to learn some new skill sets. You're going to have some different insights and new information that you're going to make it better, stronger, and a lot, and more effective. And if we're talking about conveying important information, you constantly want to keep tweaking it. You constantly want to keep coming back to the drawing board, and with new ideas, with different ways to reach audiences. And if you are working with different populations on a rotating basis, and I think about just being in New York City, what works in Central Brooklyn and East Flatbush, Brownsville, Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy may not be applicable for what goes on in Harlem, or what goes on in the Bronx, or what goes on in Queens. Because although it's one city, these are so many different populations with millions of people in each borough. And so you can't just apply the same blueprint. This has to be an ever-evolving process.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's a great way to look at things. Just taking that framework that you've worked on and just reevaluating and scratching things out and rebuilding from that original basis just really helps transform the whole object that you're looking to work on. So I can definitely see the connection there. Well, I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Gore. This has been a great conversation. I feel like I've learned so much for my life and what I do, and even with my family, and so much about your organization. It's been truly impactful, and I just want to thank you again. I also, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying thank you for having me. And I hope this is not the last time that we connect.
Absolutely, absolutely. This will not be the last time. And once again, thank you for that. And I just want to thank everyone who's watching and who's joining us today. We hope you enjoyed, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the week and what AppCon 2.0 has to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.